Explosions. Welcome back to Citizens Forum. I'm Will Smith. I'd like to thank our volunteers, all the crew here at Shaw for helping us get this production together every other week. My guest today is Dr. Susanna Rubsat, who has written a book called Mourning the Dream, Amor Fati. She is a Jungian art therapist, and we're going to have an interesting conversation about this book, what it's about, and how she started writing it. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Rubsat, and could you just tell, I'm just so curious how you started off, because I had a hard time engaging in the book, and I will read it, but I want to know what got you started in this?
Well, I think a lifetime of making art, and then just noticing that through art making there were shifts in consciousness that were happening that I couldn't quite explain, but I just kept painting and drawing. And
now this is in yourself?
Yes, just in my own process. And then I continued to get educated and started to study more art, fine arts, and went into counseling and education, and just got more and more interested in what happens in the creative process that shifts people's consciousness. And then I had the unfortunate experience in 1986 of losing all my vision. And I did gain 50% or so back, but that was quite a traumatic experience, and obviously there was a shift in consciousness there, and I was afraid I wouldn't be able to make art anymore. But the fact is, your hands can still move. And so I continued to make art, and as my vision came back enough to be able to actually engage visually again enough, I started to compare, well, the shift in consciousness through a trauma like that and the shift in consciousness in art making, what's that relationship? And so later on I went back and did my studies in art therapy and was offering this to other people, like what happens when we're in a state of trauma and trying to heal, and how the art then comes in as a kind of escort through working through embodying the trauma. And it doesn't have to be trauma, it can be whatever's going on in your life, and how that helps us, and kind of like finding an image in the dark, I call it, or learning how to see again. And also the notion of blindness or lack of vision is kind of a metaphor for lack of consciousness.
Yes.
So that's kind of not a nutshell, but that's...
No, but that's very, so you were already involved with counseling, and so this was opening up a new area for you.
Yeah, and inadvertently I started getting people to initially start with their eyes closed and using both hands, not thinking, oh, I'm inviting them into my dark world, where, you know, mythologically we're going into the underworld where things are happening that we don't understand. We're going into the unconscious. So
the abyss.
Exactly. So the metaphors started to build, and people would drop very quickly once they started working this way, and images and emotions would come up that then we could more consciously start to work with, and have the art as a vehicle of, well, look what happened here, look at the emotions that were present here, look at the images that arose, and start to have a dialogue that kind of is like the dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious.
Well, so this is autobiographical, and you are exploring this, you're exploring your own and just sort of showing us what it looks like, right?
Well, to some degree it's autobiographical or autobiographical inquiry, but it's also framed within a depth psychology perspective. So I'm using Jung's work, I'm using depth psychology's discourse in terms of, well, how do we frame these experiences through archetypes, through what happens throughout humanity when we go through these different phases, life phases, particularly traumatic events, and what happens to us both personally and collectively. And in the book I invite people to go into their own inquiry. Like, what is your story? What are your images? What happens to you when you're in the middle of an aesthetic experience and there's an aha? Like, what happens there? And how do we unpack that? How do we then bring that into consciousness? And then also the embodied piece, so that we're not all in the head, oh, I've got it all figured out, but we're actually embodying and integrating the experiences.
How about one of the things that just comes to mind when we're talking about this is that sometimes it's hard to talk about what happened to us.
Yes.
We have such a, I mean, I remember talking in my teenage years, I talked to a woman who had been she had been briefly at Auschwitz. She had just been there for like 2 days. And you know, I was naturally curious if she could remember anything.
Yeah.
And she absolutely couldn't remember. So this kind of gets you over the hump of being able, you can just draw anything, right?
Yeah,
and
I mean, things arise out of the unconscious spontaneously. I mean, we think scribbles don't mean anything, but they do, because every mark has a feeling, has a physical aspect to it. It's just that we don't know how to read it. But over time, you start to learn what your own gestures mean, what feelings are going in the body, what states of mind are happening, what's the story that's coming through the body, through the mark making.
Okay.
And so people don't necessarily remember or even want to go through difficult scenarios, but through the art, it can be released and then be presented in a different way.
So it's sort of, you're informing yourself to some extent, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And with the art, you never know what's going to come up.
And so you don't even know necessarily when you express this, what is going to come out.
No.
And it might come out years later, right?
Possibly. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, this is very interesting. So this is art that is a self-expression, but you're not saying this is how I see the world to show in a museum. You're showing it to yourself.
It's very different.
So you're teaching a class on this also, you mentioned?
I've been teaching courses over the years in Vancouver, training art therapists, and now I'm here in Victoria and doing some workshops in my studio, and I also will be teaching some actual courses for people in terms of this approach at the Vancouver Island Counseling Center for Immigrants and Refugees.
Okay.
So this will be offered for people who want to look into a different modality of working with trauma, working with a less verbal oriented, analytical way of approaching what's going on in the body, what's going on in the psyche.
Okay. Well, so really anyone who wants to find out about this type of self-exploration would be interested in this book, right?
I think so. Yeah, not just clinicians or practitioners, but anybody who's interested in creativity and spirituality. I think there's definitely undertones of an archetypal story that's going on beneath our own narrative. Like we kind of know, I am this and I am that, and I've got my thing. But at the same time, there's a kind of a subliminal narrative that's working on us, which we're not necessarily aware of.
Yeah.
But through this approach, not just through art making, it can be through writing or any creative modality, it drops us into that place of, well, what's going on this other level that's affecting us, but we may not be aware of what and how. So dreams come into play.
I think one of the reasons that I'm so interested in this topic for us now is that I see that, I just read this paper called Deep Adaptation by a professor at Cumbria University, I think it's in Wales, and his name is Dr. Jem Bendel, and he's talking about how the whole scenario that we have going on the earth right now with our very existence is threatened, that he thinks that the whole point of it is the change of consciousness, and that we're learning that consciousness is primary. So this ties into that. It's not just all of us are going through traumatic experiences right now. Our planet is threatened. Whether we choose to acknowledge that or not is something else.
It's coming through the body.
But yeah, that's what I'm getting, is that all of us are probably suffering from some malaise, because at some mammalian level we know we're in trouble.
Yeah,
I mean, when the elephants feel the tsunami going in their feet, they take off for the hills, and we've lost that ability. So this is really opened it up for me about what you're doing. So let's talk about this word mythopoetic, because that's kind of an intimidating word. So explain that word.
Mythopoetic, myth is the story, collectively or personally. The myth tells us who we are, where we came from, and why, culturally and or personally.
But it's real. It's not. Some people use myth as if it's a lie, but it's not really. It's in some ways it's truer than the truth, because it shows you the
truth. It's a symbolic way of seeing. So it's a symbolic response to your own story.
Okay.
So there'll be more layers to it. So myth is the story, symbolically and realistically, and poetic is that reflexive capacity. So when you look into your story through a creative process, writing, poetry, dance, music, art making, you're looking at it in a different way, and in that creative process it transforms it. So your story actually changes through you taking a mythopoetic sensibility, I call it.
I see.
You're seeing through it, as James Hillman, one of my teachers, would say, you're seeing through the event to the essence of it. So that's where the archetypes come in. So you see part of your process is not just individual, but oh, this is part of this particular archetypal process.
Okay, so let's talk about archetype. Archetype, that word is, let's talk about that word. What does that word mean exactly?
Well, archa means original and type is type, so the original type. So, for example, in trauma, there's a dyad between the victim and the perpetrator. So you're locked into that dynamic. Well, that's archetypal. That happens all over the world. That's how wars are made. So the original template is simply that. It's a dyad. So when we understand it archetypally, we realize, oh, I'm in that story. It's not me personally that's at fault, or necessarily that other person's fault. We're caught in that dynamic. And so archetypes are things that all humans experience.
Right, so it's that basic story that we experience a variation of it, but this is the original story, right? Okay.
And I think with that framing, I personally, and I've noticed with my students and clients, it's less lonely. It's like, oh, I'm caught up in this particular pattern, and I can start to read the patterns, and I can read myths and fairy tales or go to films, and I can see that pattern elsewhere outside of myself. And so art making too is seeing the pattern outside of oneself, and then you can come into relationship with it, because now there's two. It's not just in you and unconscious, it's out there and relationship.
So this, in your book, you're talking about your own self-expression, which is through art and through poetry.
Mostly, and photography.
And photography. So, but really, this is applicable if someone. I imagine that this idea is new to some people, some of our viewers, but this is really applicable to doing music or dance or any, because the point is you're not in your head, you're in your body, and that's one of the really
part.
important. And we've kind of gotten away from that to some extent in our culture, so this is bringing back of it.
And also the aesthetic experience, when you're completely involved in the creative process, there's a transcendent piece that happens. But we don't want just transcendence, we want descendance too, which is about
connection. The
soul. It's about going down and into the muck of life. So it's not that sort of spiritual bypass materialism, it's the whole embodiment.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rubsat. That's really fascinating, and take a look at this book, and you might be really interested in it if you're having trouble navigating our current reality. Thank you very much for watching this segment of Citizens Forum.
Thank you very much.